It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. This week,
I want to welcome to our gallery the Ukraine Ambassador.
MPs unite in support for Ukraine at Prime Minister's questions, but Keir Starmer wants tougher sanctions.
Why are we giving Putin's cronies 18 months to quietly launder their money out of the UK property market and into another safe haven?
I think the whole House should be proud of what we have done because we have led the way on this.
1 million refugees have fled Ukraine. The Home Secretary sets out the UK's response.
It will mean that the British public and the Ukrainian diaspora can support displaced Ukrainians in the UK.
We must make sure that that actually happens in practice and that bureaucratic hurdles, that delays, that obstacles do not get in the way.
And at Holyrood, Nicola Sturgeon goes further.
I would appeal again to the UK government to effectively have a situation where anybody fleeing Ukraine can come to the UK and we deal with the bureaucracy and the paperwork later.
Let's start here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Susan, as we heard in the headlines, this week has again been dominated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's left hundreds of thousands of women and children fleeing for their lives. How has the week unfolded here?
Well, as you say, those terrible pictures of people suffering in Ukraine has absolutely dominated everything at Westminster as everywhere else, with MPs looking to see what the UK and the world generally can do. No military action, no direct military action. Britain and NATO have made that clear, that that is just far too dangerous. So the focus has very much been on what else can be done, and particularly economic sanctions. The Prime Minister has said that that will be ratcheted up. A lot of MPs have said you could go further. So the Foreign Secretary came along on Monday, right at the start of the week, to come up with another wodge of things that the UK was going to do. For example, Russian banks basically won't be able to do business in London any longer. Also, there's going to be more on banning exports of sensitive materials to Russia, things like high-end electronics, marine navigation equipment, that kind of thing. What we didn't get were any names of individuals to be sanctioned, and that's something that MPs have very much been pushing for. We'll hear a lot of that, I think, in this programme. But the Foreign Secretary was there to say that also this wasn't an end of it, there would be more.
The UK and our allies will have to undergo some economic hardship as a result of our sanctions. But our hardships are nothing compared to those endured by the people of Ukraine. So I say to our Ukrainian friends, we're with you. In Britain and around the world, we're prepared to suffer economic sacrifices to support you. However long it takes, we will not rest until Ukraine's sovereignty is restored.
Oligarchs are being frozen out of their bank accounts, and the Central Bank of Russia is being blocked from part of the 640 billion war chest that it holds in foreign reserves. Labour's priority is to cut off Putin's rogue state from our economic system and to undermine his campaign of aggression in Ukraine.
What plans are to tackle and target the family members of oligarchs? When we were in Kyiv recently, that was mentioned as a particularly effective way of putting on pressure.
Could I urge the Foreign Secretary to see how we can widen the sanctions package internationally? Any sanctions that we impose will be mopped up by Russia's new long-term friend, China. The UN General Assembly is sitting today. Could I urge the UK to put in a resolution on sanctions, which means that China is obliged to follow them along with everybody else?
The Chinese did not vote with the Russians at the UN Security Council, and I'm making it very clear to China and other major nations of their responsibilities to protect sovereignty and self-determination of Ukraine, and we continue to put pressure on them.
Last week, I named 35 Russian oligarchs that are on the Navalny list. Can she assure this House that we will not stop, we will follow the money, and no matter where their money may or may not be transferred to, we will find it and we will seize it?
Yeah. Well, I can assure the Honourable Lady that that is exactly what we are doing. We have a very large team of people working through our hit list of oligarchs, and we're also looking at their properties, their ownerships of yachts. We've already grounded their private jets.
Following on from that debate, Susan, there was a statement from the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, on what were referred to as economic crime measures. What did he say?
Yeah, chief among that is an economic crime bill, which is actually going to be whizzed into law next week in just a day. That is to tackle the way Russian oligarchs, other foreign people can set up a company very easily in Britain. It only costs about 12 quid, I think. And the company name appears, but your name doesn't. And people, it's believed, are using that to hide illicitly gained wealth in the UK. So this economic crime bill is designed to clear up that. However, Labour say that, well, they support the bill. They say it's actually not going to come into force quickly enough and gives oligarchs time to squirrel their money away somewhere else.
And they obviously think it's not strong enough, as we said. It was an issue which was raised by the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, at Prime Minister's questions, as well why some Russian oligarchs are still not facing sanctions.
Yeah, that's right. There's been a lot of pushback on why the government isn't moving faster on individuals. I think there's some legal problems. The government doesn't want to name names or actually move quickly until they're sure they've got a very watertight legal case. However, there is a rule in Parliament where you can name people and you can't be legally got at for that. And that is what Keir Starmer did. It was an interesting Prime Minister's questions. It was really, you know, there is that emotional pull of those pictures of people in Ukraine. So you saw lots of MPs wearing either those blue and yellow lapel ribbons or, in fact, dressed in blue and yellow in the Ukrainian colours. And, of course, I should explain, there are these galleries around the top of the chamber where members of the public and the press can sit. And the Ukrainian ambassador was up there and he got a really powerful welcome and he looked quite moved. I was sitting quite close by in the press gallery and you could see he stood up as well. The cameras aren't allowed to show that. He stood up and he bowed and he clapped back. So it was quite a moment.
I want to welcome to our gallery the Ukraine ambassador. Your Excellency, we generally do not allow applause in this chamber. But on this occasion, the House quite rightly wants to demonstrate our respect and support for your country and its people.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad the Ambassador is here so he can hear me repeat what I've said to him privately on a number of occasions, and that is that this House and this country stand united in our support for the Ukrainian people in the face of Russian aggression. Roman Abramovich is the owner of Chelsea Football Club and various other high-value assets in the United Kingdom. He's a person of interest to the Home Office because of his links to the Russian state and his public association with corrupt activity and practices. Last week, the Prime Minister said that Abramovich is facing sanctions. He later corrected the record to say that he isn't. Well, why on earth isn't he?
Mr. Speaker, it's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases at this stage. But be in no doubt that the actions that we've already taken, that this House has already taken, are having an effect in Moscow.
Last week, Putin summoned to the Kremlin the cronies who prop up his regime. They dipped their hands in the blood of Putin's war. Among them was Igor Shuvalov, Putin's former Deputy Prime Minister. Shuvalov owns 2 flats, not 5 minutes' walk from this house. They're worth over £11 million. He is on the EU sanctions list, but he's not on the UK sanctions list. When will the Prime Minister sort this out?
Mr. Speaker, I think the House should be proud of what we have done already, and I can tell him that there is more to be done, and thanks to the powers that this House and this government has taken, we can sanction any individual, any company connected with the Putin regime.
The Prime Minister refers to the long overdue economic crime bill, which, to be clear, we support and will vote through on Monday with speed. The key plank to that bill is a register of who truly owns property in the United Kingdom. But it doesn't come into force for existing owners like Shuvalov until 18 months after the bill passes. Why are we giving Putin's cronies 18 months to quietly launder their money out of the UK property market and into another safe haven?
I think the whole House should be proud of what we have done, because we have led the way on this. We led the way on SWIFT, we led the way on Aeroflot, we led the way on freezing the assets of banks. And if he asks about the speed of results, Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that on Thursday, the Russian stock market fell by $250 billion worth of assets that were wiped off.
To prosecute Putin and his regime, the full range of war crime charges need to be used, including the crime of aggression by a state. But the UK has always refused to sign up to the prosecution of this crime in international law. Surely, with Putin's crime of aggression in plain and horrific sight in Ukraine, now is the time to drop that opposition.
What we have seen already from Vladimir Putin's regime in the use of the munitions that they have already been dropping on innocent civilians, Mr. Speaker, in my view, already fully qualifies as a war crime.
Boris Johnson answering questions there from the SNP leader at Westminster, Ian Blackford. And in response to the allegations made by Keir Starmer, a spokesperson for Roman Abramovich denied those claims and said he hadn't done anything which would make him sanctionable. Susan, thank you for the moment. We'll come back to you later on in the programme. Let's go to Edinburgh, to Holyrood, and speak to our correspondent there, David Wallace-Lockhart. Hello to you, David. I mean, the events in Ukraine have been dominating politics across the world, really, and that includes Scotland. This week, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has been calling on the UK government to do more for refugees.
That's right, Joe. And actually, Nicola Sturgeon did say that the UK government deserves some credit for its response to the crisis. It said, in some respects, it had been very strong, specifically on sanctions. But you're right in saying on the issue of refugees fleeing the region, that's where she wants to see UK ministers go further. Nicola Sturgeon said that she essentially wants to see the scheme the EU has introduced of allowing anyone fleeing Ukraine to come to an EU member state and stay for 3 years without claiming asylum. That's the system she'd like to see emulated in the United Kingdom. And she was appearing in front of committee conveners in Holyrood this week for a question and answer session. And here's what she had to say on that topic.
I would appeal again to the UK government to effectively have a situation where anybody fleeing Ukraine can come to the UK and we deal with the bureaucracy and the paperwork later. That's the humanitarian response that is required, but it's also what is practically necessary, because no single country or small group of countries is going to be able to deal with this alone. So I hope that we will see further movement from the UK government. For my part, and this is my responsibility, we will continue to work with COSLA to make sure that we are ready to provide the assistance that refugees need.
Now, the UK government is stressing that they believe the scheme they've introduced is generous and it could lead to over 200,000 Ukrainians finding sanctuary in the UK.
And the issue of Ukraine was still dominant for much of First Minister's questions.
That's right, Joe. And the session this week started out with all party leaders supporting an emergency appeal and asking people in Scotland to donate to that. But Nicola Sturgeon was also asked if she'd be willing to take action to ensure that people with interests in Scotland who may have links to the Kremlin, links to Vladimir Putin, if she was willing to ensure that they didn't get any sort of public funds. So let's have a look at that question and answer that came from this week's First Minister's questions.
Can I ask the First Minister if the Scottish Government will urgently review the agricultural payment system and any other relevant payment system to ensure that no member of the Russian elite, no Kremlin associate, is in receipt of public money here in Scotland?
First Minister. Yes, I will ensure that that review happens. In fact, I can advise Parliament that I have sought urgent advice on the maximum possible action that the Scottish Government can take within our powers against individuals and entities identifying as having close links with the Russian regime, whether or not they are currently on the UK sanctions list. Options that will be examined include, but are not limited to, ending support from the public purse and freezing or seizing assets in Scotland where that is possible. And I, of course, will keep Parliament fully updated.
And Nicola Sturgeon actually went even further after that. She went on to say that ministers would be writing an open letter to business in Scotland, encouraging them essentially to cut links with Russia. And that letter did go out later in the name of Finance Secretary Kate Forbes. And in it, she says that severing links with Russia for business in Scotland is the right decision. She said that businesses will be supported in their attempts to do so. And in the letter, she also spelled out that the Scottish Government and its economic agencies will be practising what they preach. They will be cutting ties when it comes to trade and investment in Russia. And the Finance Secretary was quite honest in her letter, saying there will be economic harm to Scotland as a result of this. But she said any price paid here is significantly less than that being paid by the people of Ukraine.
David, there was a different significant moment in Holyrood this week as well. A long-awaited bill on gender recognition reform was introduced. Tell us about it.
So this is an issue that's been quite dominant in Scottish politics for a number of years now. A manifesto commitment from both the Greens and the SNP, who are of course now making up the Scottish Government, that they wanted to make it easier for someone to legally change their gender in Scotland. There are women's pressure groups who oppose the change. They've got concerns about what it could mean for women's only spaces. But the Scottish Government have been stressing that under their plans there are no changes to the protection that women currently receive under the Equality Act. So this week, at long last, the bill was published, and most of it we knew about when it comes to the details. Essentially, what the Scottish Government are wanting to do is remove the need for someone to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria if they want to change their gender. So that essentially is moving more towards what we'd call self-ID. The age for someone to legally change their gender, they want to bring that down from 18 to 16 years old. And the time that someone has to spend living as their acquired gender, the Scottish Government also with this bill wants to cut that time down from 2 years to 3 months, with a further 3-month reflection period after that. And anyone who did want to change their gender would have to make a legally binding declaration that they intend to live out the rest of their life in their acquired gender. So that bill was introduced this week at Holyrood with a ministerial statement, which is a slightly different way to do it, not the norm here. But let's have a look at that statement and some of the questions that followed.
Our proposals for change and progress have caused discussion and debate. We know there are people who have campaigned for such changes for years. We know there are others who have concerns. This afternoon, I'll seek to allay some of those concerns by explaining what the bill does and, importantly, what it doesn't do. It does not introduce new rights or remove rights. It does not change public policy or prevent single-sex services being offered where appropriate. It does not change rules or conventions in place and in place for years under the current system, for example, access to toilets and changing rooms.
The proposals, as they stand, do not protect women's rights. They do not offer enough protection for women's safety. The concerns of women are legitimate. They are reasonable. They are honestly and sincerely held. So will the Cabinet Secretary agree to listen again to the valid concerns of women who feel that their rights are under threat?
Now, this legislation realistically will pass. 4 out of 5 Holyrood parties back it. What could be more interesting is internal party splits on the issue. We know there are figures in the SNP not entirely comfortable with the direction of reform here. And on the other side, we know in the Scottish Conservatives there are figures potentially a bit uncomfortable with the idea of reform not being backed.
Thank you, David. That's David Wallace-Lockhart at Holyrood in Edinburgh. Let's return to Westminster and the war in Ukraine with you, Susan. One of the tragic but unsurprising consequences of the Russian invasion is the sheer number of people fleeing their homes in Ukraine and crossing the border mainly into Poland. The government was criticised for not doing enough for the refugees. What happened?
Yeah, it was interesting at the beginning of David's report there, seeing Nicola Sturgeon saying we should let people come here and ask questions, sort out the bureaucracy later. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, came to the Commons to talk about how refugees would be allowed in, but she said she didn't want to do that. And the reason for that was that she feared that Russians would be infiltrating some Ukrainians maybe coming here. And we've already seen Vladimir Putin's willingness to do violence on British soil. However, after a bit of confusion about who would be let in at the start of the week, she came to the Commons with a more generous package. So British nationals and Ukrainians who are settled here can bring a wider number of family members. After we'd seen some quite distressing pictures from elderly mothers stuck at a Paris railway station, not able to come in. So she said now those people will be allowed to bring in wider families such as siblings or adult children. And even if you don't have family in the UK, there will be a route. There's a sponsorship route where communities can sponsor Ukrainians to come here as well. It did get quite a broad welcome from opposition MPs, though they did have a lot of questions after Priti Patel had outlined her plans.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very generous and it is an expansive and unprecedented package. It will mean that the British public and the Ukrainian diaspora can support displaced Ukrainians in the UK until they are able to return to a free and a sovereign Ukraine.
We have a huge responsibility to work alongside other European countries to provide sanctuary to those who are fleeing war in Europe. But we must make sure that that actually happens in practice and that bureaucratic hurdles, that delays, that obstacles do not get in the way of people showing the support across the country that they want to show for those who have fled the appalling fighting in Ukraine.
Can we do, please, as we did in 1956 and 1968, cut through the red tape and get these people home so that their menfolk fighting and dying on the streets of Kyiv can at least know that their women and their children are safe?
Why is it that yet again, at a time of humanitarian crisis, the Home Office is having to be dragged towards a generous and comprehensive response instead of a shambolic and miserly mess? For days, the Home Secretary has lagged behind the demands of the public, demands from this Parliament and even within her own party.
I do urge her to, as well as listen to all these humanitarian voices, to listen to the voices of people, for instance, in Lincolnshire, where we feel we've done really our bit in terms of migration from Eastern Europe, where we're under extreme pressure in terms of housing and jobs. I know this is difficult to say, but we have to be honest about this. And may I therefore be a correcting voice in this and congratulate her on her humanitarian but proportionate response and not throwing away the immigration rulebook.
Edward Lee, the Tory MP, there in that debate. And of course, as the invasion continues, and as does the fighting, the numbers of refugees will no doubt go up, Susan. The Nationality and Borders Bill has been in the House of Lords. And in a defeat for the government, peers voted to scrap a controversial proposal which could allow people to be deprived of their citizenship without prior notice.
Yeah, of course, we're talking about refugees coming from Ukraine while this very controversial piece of legislation is going through Parliament. The background to it was all of the migrants coming across the Channel in small boats, and that is something that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, that we saw there, is keen to clamp down on. So some of the controversial things that the Lords defeated them on this week included the criminalisation of people who come to arrive in the UK by sort of odd means, not the authorised means. Of course, if you're a refugee fleeing fighting, it can be quite difficult to apply for all the right paperwork. And there was also a defeat, as you were saying, on another controversial aspect, which is the ability to strip someone of their citizenship, British citizenship, if they commit a crime and they have access to any other kind of citizenship at all.
There are about 6 million Britons, and I declare an interest because I'm among them, who, because of another citizenship or because of their descent from people who came to Britain who chose to be Britons, have second-class citizenship. It can be taken away by the government.
The government seemed genuinely confused by the level of opposition that this clause has triggered. But this shouldn't have been surprising, because I'm afraid it's symptomatic of a serious breakdown in trust between the Home Office and society groups, particularly minority ethnic groups.
If my grandchildren were to commit not just a terrorist offence, but a criminal act, a sexual offence, a fraud, an offence involving fraud, they could, in court, be punished for the crime, but also have their citizenship stripped. That is fact. That makes me a second-class citizen. It makes my children second-class citizens. It makes their children second-class citizens.
Under this proposal, 2 in 5 British citizens from an ethnic minority background are eligible to be deprived of their citizenship without being told, since they have or may have other citizenships available to them.
It does not target dual nationals or those from ethnic minorities or particular faiths, or indeed women and girls. There is no secret decision-making, and law-abiding people have nothing to fear.
So what next for the Borders Bill?
Well, the House of Lords isn't finished with it. They've got another day to discuss it in detail. But even when they have, the bill still has to go back to the House of Commons. So those defeats are not likely to stick with the bill because, remember, while the government can get defeated in the House of Lords, it's got no majority, it does have a majority in the House of Commons. And that means the government can ask its MPs to rally round and put the bill back the way they wanted.
Susan, thank you. Let's go to our reporter, Amelia Belly, who can tell us what's happening in the Welsh Parliament. Hello to you. First Minister's questions, perhaps unsurprisingly, also dominated by the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes, Jo, that's right. Tuesday was the first time that the Senedd had met since Russia launched its offensive on Ukraine, and the First Minister was called upon to make an urgent statement. He sent a message of condemnation and solidarity.
The Welsh flag and the Ukrainian flag are flying together over the Welsh Government building in the civic centre of our capital city. And we do that, Llywydd, because the people of Wales are appalled at the invasion of Ukraine. And as a nation of sanctuary, we will do everything we can to support the Ukrainian people. Wales is open to provide a welcome and safety.
Now, despite that promise of openness, Mark Drakeford says that refugees wanting to come to the UK from Ukraine are still encountering lots of Home Office red tape. He says those are things like biometric data and form filling. Now, when the Prime Minister was challenged on this, he says that the current arrangements towards refugees are already very generous and something to be proud of, but expect that pressure from the First Minister to continue towards the UK government. Now, for some in the Senedd, the conflict that's going on is particularly personal. Wales's chief legal advisor, Mick Antoniv, was born in what is now modern-day Ukraine, and he had this message.
There is several lines in the Ukrainian national anthem which were sung on the steps here last night. The first line is Vženemela. Perhaps it's closest to Imalhid. Ukraine has not died. The other line is Dushu chilom my položím za našu svobodu, that we will lay down our body and our soul for our freedom. Llywydd, the war in Ukraine has turned into a war against the people of Ukraine, and all our thoughts are with those people who have taken up arms to defend democracy and to fight for freedom, including members of my own family. Slava Ukraini, heroyam slava. Thank you.
That applause a level of the support shown from people here to people in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And when it comes to implementing domestic embargoes against Russia, Amelia, we've seen some issues around shipments of oil.
Yes, that's right. So while the UK has banned vessels associated with Russia from coming here, currently there's no ban on Russian cargo, so things like oil and gas. Now, in West Wales, there's a port called Milford Haven that sees high volumes of raw materials like oil and gas passing through it every day. And so there's been some confusion over the last few days, several ships carrying Russian cargo being turned away, with lots of confusion remaining about these sanctions.
Essentially, they're getting around that by using a flag of convenience country, in this case the Marshall Islands. Do you agree with me that those loopholes that are clearly being used at the moment need to be closed off urgently, and that not a single drop of Russian oil should be offloaded into Wales through a Welsh port while innocent blood is being shed in Ukraine?
It is inevitable, Llywyd, that in such a very fast-moving picture, that when governments take one action, attempts will be made to try and subvert it and to get round it. But when those loopholes are identified, then the UK government will need to act again to make sure that the intent of their policy, which clearly is to prevent Russian oil being disembarked at UK ports, that policy is effective.
Now, the UK government says that the sanctions currently only apply to ships owned, controlled or operated by people connected to Russia. But that is something the First Minister says he'll be raising with them in the coming days. Away from urgent issues around the conflict in Ukraine, which will, of course, continue, we saw other long-standing debates continue as well, in particular whether Wales's National Feast Day should become a bank holiday. Yes, although what was unusual about the disagreements is it wasn't between the four main political parties in the Senedd. They're united. Their quibble is with the UK government. They want to see the powers devolved to make March the 1st, St David's Day, a bank holiday here in Wales. Similar powers have been devolved for years and years in Northern Ireland and Scotland. And the Welsh Conservatives say the same move here could have huge benefits.
It's not only the 60 of us sat in this chamber or on Zoom that think St David's Day should be a bank holiday, but this is something that Welsh people support too. Not only did 10,000 people recently sign a petition calling on St David's Day becoming a bank holiday, but a BBC Wales poll showed that 87% of people in Wales also supported the idea. And we also know there are significant economic benefits in the day becoming a bank holiday. According to the Centre for Economics and Business Research, retail sales are traditionally boosted by 15% for a bank holiday, with hospitality and catering boosted by 20%. And after facing tough measures and trying to bounce back from the pandemic, wouldn't it be a welcome change for these industries to have that long-term added benefit to them as well?
Now, the moves to make St David's Day a bank holiday have been going on for decades, with no sign of budging from the UK government. But what was particularly interesting about the debate was that even the Welsh Conservatives said that they hoped their colleagues in Westminster were listening to the level of consensus here for that to happen. Thank you very much, Amelia. Amelia Belly there at the Welsh Parliament. Let's go to Stormont now and talk to our reporter there, Jim Fitzpatrick. Hello, Jim. The Assembly has been debating climate change legislation. What are the latest developments?
Well, the debate here, Joe, has essentially been one between the DUP Agriculture and Environment Minister, Edwin Poots, and other parties. The Minister wants to limit the impact of any climate change legislation on the agricultural sector, whereas other parties feel that that sector has to play its fair part. So, for instance, this week, the Minister proposed an amendment, number 17, which would have removed agriculture from the calculations altogether. Other parties mocked that potential move. But here's the Minister, who is outlining another amendment, this one on methane emissions.
Amendment number 1 ensures that in the context of aiming for net zero emissions by 2050, the level of reductions in methane emissions is not required to be more than 46% lower than the baseline. The potential level of reductions in methane emissions is consistent, and this is important, with the advice from the IPCC and with the CCC's balanced pathway recommendations around methane and the ambition that we should have in terms of reducing emissions of it. But importantly, it will prevent a situation where, in the context of aiming for overall net zero, disproportionate reductions in methane emissions are pursued.
This should never have become a battle
between agriculture and environment. And whilst it might have suited some in this chamber to frame it that way, it has done a disservice to this climate legislation debate. In my view, that the same could be said of the Minister's Amendment number 17 to exclude the agriculture sector from the outworkings of this bill. It is a total nonsense amendment. I actually thought the amendment, when I first saw it, was an early April Fool's joke. I hope the Minister reads today's IPPC report, and I hope it resonates with him. The Minister needs to realise that we need to move on climate change and to protect our farmers and agri-food sector here. As in the North, it will be they who, in years to come, will be hit hardest by the impact of global warming.
Today's IPCC report confirmed what we all know. Wealthy nations like the UK disproportionately bear responsibility for climate change, yet are least exposed to its disastrous effects. Low-income communities in the Global South urgently need justice to cope with escalating loss and damage and to adapt for the future. To create loopholes and exemptions of our responsibilities here in Northern Ireland is to turn our back on those who are most at risk and least responsible for the climate emergency. Not only that, Deputy Speaker, but in protecting one strand of one industry, we stand to lose enormous economic and social opportunities and confine Northern Ireland to being the carbon outlier of Europe.
Well, the Minister got his way on the methane emissions, but not on that other suggestion of removing agriculture from the calculations altogether.
Jim, on a retail issue, the members of the Legislative Assembly were also debating the benefits this week of shopping vouchers you've been given in Northern Ireland. Tell us about them.
Yes, we've mentioned these before.
Yes.
This was the proposal and, in fact, the scheme to give out £100 vouchers to those that were eligible in Northern Ireland. 1.4 million people in the end got the vouchers, and the idea was to boost the economy in the aftermath of lockdown. However, the problem was the scheme was delayed, and then many people got their vouchers and indeed spent their money in December, the busiest shopping time of the month. So the question being debated this week was this a good use of taxpayers' money, or was it a waste of money? The Minister himself was very clear where he thought the benefits were.
I am sure that members will have heard the same positive messages that I heard from businesses within their own constituencies. But that has also been confirmed by independent analysis. According to an Ulster Bank survey, retail sales in Northern Ireland rose in November 2021 for the first time in 4 months. The bank's chief economist, Richard Ramsay, said the High Street scheme undoubtedly contributed to the pickup in demand.
You refer in your statement to research in December 21 showing an increase in shoppers. Of course, most Decembers see an increase in footfall with respect, and that's why it was designed to be avoided in December. Does the data you've seen so far break down where the spend happened in terms of merchant code, i.e. do you know how much of this was spent in large multiple supermarkets and chain stores versus small independent retail? And if so, will your department publish that data at some stage?
First of all, I think the data that I actually referred to was in October-November time. The greatest impact was seen in November time, and I think it is to be welcomed because we naturally see a bit of an increase in December time. However, I don't believe that it necessarily was the case that replaced Christmas spend that would otherwise have happened. In fact, the anecdotal evidence that I have so far is that was additional spend on top of what normally would have been spent at Christmas. But importantly, it maybe had the ability to bring some of that spend off online and into the high street, and then creates that multiplier effect as well. The member asked specifically about the merchant code. I did have some of that data, however, I am bound by the rules on official statistics. That will be released later on this month. That's what I was referring to in the statement. I want that to be released. I believe it will show that the spending was exactly where we wanted it to be.
So everyone who received their voucher no doubt enjoyed spending it, but was it money that they would have spent otherwise? I suppose that's the question that still needs to be answered.
Jim, I remember you saying that you received one of these vouchers, so did you spend it wisely?
Very wisely, a nice meal for me and the wife. So, you know, couldn't get better than that. Now, would I have done that otherwise without the voucher? Well, as I say, it's hard to tell.
Well, I do hope so. Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick there at Stormont. Let's return to Westminster and our correspondent Susan Hume. Let's talk about the police bill, because it was back in the House of Commons this week. Now, it's a very wide-ranging bill. We've talked about it before, covering police work, sentencing policy and public order. Now, there's been an awful awful lot of controversy over this bill, hasn't there?
That's right. It's another of these whopping great controversial bills from the Home Office, from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. One of the things, well, we were talking earlier about how in the House of Lords, because the government doesn't have a majority, it can make changes to bills, and they did with this one. And one of the things that happened in the House of Lords was the introduction of a new law into this bill, which would make misogyny, hatred of women, a hate crime, a bit like attacking someone over race or religion is now. So that was inserted into the bill, and that meant the bill has to come back to the House of Commons. Now, the government says, it sounds good, but actually legal bodies say it's not a very good idea. They don't recommend it because it can have all sorts of unintended consequences. So they did get MPs to take that out of the bill again. However, there were quite a lot of MPs on both sides of the House, actually, who think it would have been rather a good idea to make misogyny a hate crime.
I know that the Law Commission have some concerns, but this is a simple and straightforward step that will increase public awareness, improve victims' confidence, crucially in reporting, and enhance the way the police respond to violence and misogyny against women. The symbolism of this is so important, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
If we're going to start tackling the cultures that underpin male violence against women, then we have to look at the cultures that mean that some men think it is okay to harass women on the street, on public transport.
The Law Commission is very clear that there is demonstrable need for additional law when it comes to supporting and protecting women and girls, that there is more than ample evidence of the harm that is done. Their real concern is how you actually tackle this in practice. And I think we have to listen very carefully. Otherwise, we risk undoing the good work that has been done.
Many women will have experienced sexual harassment. They'll have experienced abuse, online, offline, in our daily lives, to such an extent it infuses what we do. The flinch when you come out of the tube station to make sure there's nobody behind you, carrying your keys in your hand, worrying about what your daughter is wearing, hoping that your son isn't one of those people who does it. Hate crime legislation has made a difference when it comes to religious and racial hate crime. So why should women not have that same right?
On the misogyny issue, I do commend the motivation behind this particular set of amendments that we're sadly declining. We do understand people's genuine concern about the safety of women and girls in the public sector, and indeed share it.
Now, making misogyny a hate crime may have been defeated, Susan, but we did hear about plans for tackling violence against women and girls in more general terms.
Yes, the backdrop to that is a rather critical report from the police watchdog, which said that the criminal justice system generally was failing women, particularly with the low level of prosecutions, never mind convictions, for rape. So the government came forward with a move to make it a priority for the police in England and Wales to prosecute rape, really to put it on the same footing as tackling terrorism, serious organised crime and child abuse.
And briefly, what's happened to plans in the police bill to curb noisy protests?
Yes. Now, this was in the police bill because the government wanted to tackle some of the protests that we'd seen really over climate change that were very disruptive. The House of Lords stripped it out, saying, really, what's going on if you can't bang a drum and shout a bit in a protest? It's come back. In the Commons, the government managed to put the curbs on noisy protests back, but not before one of their own, Jessie Norman, a Conservative MP, said, really, at the moment, when you look at all these people bravely protesting in Kiev and parts of the Ukraine, this is not the time to be doing this.
Susan, thank you very much. That's all we have time for. I'll be back on Monday with Politics Live at 12:15.